She stood in the rain, her white wedding dress untouched, her hands empty of flowers, a wound in her chest that didn't bleed but hurt more than any knife. The man she'd loved for 7 years had looked her straight in the eye, in front of hundreds of guests, and said he was marrying someone else, her own cousin. But tonight, fate would place something even more dangerous than love in her hands, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of all Chicago. Please like and comment with the city you're reading to let me know how far this story has progressed. The alarm went off at 5:45 in the morning, and Claire Whitmore did not need it. She had been awake since 3, lying flat on her back in the hotel suite, staring at the ceiling with both hands folded across her stomach like she was already practicing how to be still. The room smelled like fresh roses and the kind of expensive fabric softener that hotels use to make guests feel like they were sleeping inside a cloud. She hated it. She had always hated that smell, but Ethan's mother had booked the suite and Claire had smiled and said it was lovely, and that was the shape of the last 7 years distilled into a single sentence. She sat up. The wedding dress hung on the back of the closet door, white and structured and mercilessly perfect, the way she had designed every blueprint that crossed her desk. Precise, functional, nothing wasted. She had lost 12 pounds to fit into it. She had skipped 3 project deadlines. She had eaten salads she did not want in restaurants she could not afford, while Ethan ordered steak and explained patiently that a Callaway wedding needed to project a certain image. Claire Whitmore, 29 years old, licensed architect, 4 years of student debt still sitting in a spreadsheet she opened every Sunday morning. She had built herself out of nothing and handed the finished product to a man whose family had never once had to build a single thing in their lives. She stood up, walked to the window. Chicago was still dark at that hour, the lake invisible beyond the towers, just a suggestion of black water underneath a sky that had not decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. Her phone was on the nightstand. 14 unread messages. Her mother asking if she had eaten. Her best friend Dana from college sending a voice memo that was probably 15 minutes long. 2 messages from her firm's junior associate, Kenji, about a permit filing that could not wait. And nothing from Ethan. She had sent him a message at midnight. Simple. Just, I keep thinking about the house we designed together. The one on paper. I think we're going to be okay. He had not replied. She told herself it meant nothing. Grooms were nervous. She was nervous. Everybody was nervous. That was what weddings were. Organized panic in formal wear. She went to the bathroom and turned the shower on cold and stood under it for 90 seconds because she had read somewhere that cold water clarified the mind. What it actually did was make her breath come in short, hard punches and her hands curl into fists at her sides. But at least she stopped thinking about the unreturned message. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock at the Meridian Grand Ballroom, a venue that held 600 people and had a waiting list measured in years. Ethan's mother, Margaret Calloway, had spent 14 months on arrangements. There was a string quartet. There were imported flowers from a grower in the Pacific Northwest. There was a cake with 5 tiers that cost more than Claire's first car. Claire arrived at the venue at 9 and was immediately absorbed into a machine of hairpins, lipstick, and women she barely knew, touching her face with practiced efficiency. Her mother sat in the corner with her hands in her lap and her mouth pressed into a thin line that could have been happiness or fear or both at once. "You look beautiful," her mother said. "Mom." "You do. Stop looking at me like that." Her mother looked away. Outside the window of the bridal suite, the sky had made up its mind. Clouds, low and gray, the kind that didn't threaten so much as promise. Dana arrived at 10 with a flask in her purse and the expression of someone who had been rehearsing a speech. Dana had never liked Ethan. She had said so precisely once, 3 years ago, and Claire had shut the conversation down so completely that Dana never raised it again. But the expression on her face that morning, the careful way she smiled, the way she held the flask out and then put it away when Claire shook her head, that was the expression of a woman honoring a promise she had made to herself to stay quiet. "He's here?" Claire asked. "He's here," Dana said. "Groomsmen are in the East Hall." "And he—" Claire stopped. She was going to ask if Ethan had asked about her. She recognized the shape of the question in her mouth and swallowed it. "I'll go check on the florist," Dana said and left. At 10:47, 13 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, One of Ethan's groomsmen, a thin, sweating young man named Porter, who had the specific energy of someone delivering news he desperately did not want to deliver, knocked on the bridal suite door and said that Ethan would like to speak with Claire before they went in. "Before?" Claire's mother said. "Yes, ma'am." "That's not Mom." Claire stood. She smoothed the front of her dress out of habit. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. She catalogued it the way she catalogued structural anomalies on a site inspection. The thing that was wrong that she could not yet name. "I'll go." Porter led her down a service corridor that ran alongside the main ballroom. She could hear the string quartet warming up, could feel the low hum of 600 people arranged in rows behind closed doors, could smell the flowers. Ethan was waiting in a small side room off the corridor, the kind of room that held spare tables and folded linens. He was in his tuxedo. His hair was perfect. He looked, objectively, like someone a woman should want to marry, and Claire looked at him and felt something she could not immediately identify. It took her 3 full seconds to understand that what she felt was distance, like looking at a building she had designed on paper and seeing it constructed in a material that was not what she had specified. "Hey," she said. Ethan turned around. He had his hands clasped behind his back. He was doing the thing he did when he was working up to something. The slight tightening around the jaw, the controlled exhale. "I can't do this," he said. Claire said nothing. "Claire, He stopped, started again. "Lillian is pregnant." The room was very quiet. Through the wall, she could hear the string quartet had stopped tuning and started playing something slow. "My cousin Lillian," Claire said. Her voice came out flat, not as a question. It wasn't something I planned." "How long?" "Claire." "How long, Ethan?" He looked at the wall. 8 months. 8 months. She ran the architecture of the last 8 months through her mind the way she would run load calculations, fast, mechanical, without mercy. The weekend he had worked late on the Singapore pitch. The conference in Boston she had not been invited to attend. The way he had been, in small increments, slightly less available without ever being entirely gone, like a structure settling on a faulty foundation, millimeter by millimeter, in ways that were invisible until one morning you walked in and the wall had cracked clean through. "You were going to stand up there," she said. "I was trying to find the right... You were going to stand up there in front of 600 people and say those words, and you have known for 8 months. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's more complicated than... Get out of my way!" He moved. She did not know exactly what she intended to do. She would think about this later, the way grief works in reverse, the way you understand the shape of a moment only after you have passed through it. But what she did was walk back down the corridor and straight through the door at the end of it, the door that opened directly onto the rear of the ballroom, and she walked out in front of 600 guests in her wedding dress, alone, without music, without a processional, and she stood at the head of the aisle and looked down the long white length of it toward an altar where Ethan was not standing. The room went quiet. She heard her own breathing. She heard someone near the front whisper something. She saw Margaret Calloway in the front row, perfectly composed, watching her with an expression that was not surprise. That was the thing Claire would not be able to stop thinking about for weeks afterward. Margaret's face. Not shocked, not horrified, just watching. The expression of someone whose plan was executing on schedule. Ethan came in through a side door. He walked up beside Claire and he did not reach for her hand. He faced the room instead and he spoke. And she heard the words with the odd detached clarity of someone watching the demolition of a structure they had designed themselves. He was not going to marry Claire Whitmore. He was going to marry Lillian. The child deserved a family. He was sorry. He hoped everyone would understand. 600 people. Claire turned and walked out. Dead. She did not run. She was careful about that. She walked through the lobby with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands quiet at her sides, and she pushed through the heavy glass doors into the November air, and then she was outside, and then it began to rain. She kept walking, heels on wet pavement, the sound of it precise and slightly ridiculous. The parking structure attached to the venue was 3 levels, half empty on a Saturday morning, lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly at a frequency that felt personal. She went up the ramp to the second level because she did not have a destination, only a direction, and the direction was away. She sat down on a concrete divider. She became aware slowly that her dress was wet, that her hands were cold, that she had left her phone and her coat and her wallet in the bridal suite and had no way to call anyone, and that this was somehow perfectly appropriate. She had shown up to the most prepared day of her life and walked out of it with absolutely nothing. She was crying. She discovered this the way you discover a cut. Not the moment it happens, but some seconds after, when the evidence is already there. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps. Not the aimless kind. Fast and deliberate, coming up the ramp from the ground level, and behind them, further back, heavier, other footsteps. Multiple sets. The kind of footsteps that had a geometry to them, a surrounding geometry, that the part of her brain that solved spatial problems recognized before the rest of her caught up. A man came around the corner at the top of the ramp. He was moving hard, one hand pressed flat against his side, his suit jacket hanging open. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair and the kind of face that was hard to read in the best circumstances and completely unreadable now. His eyes swept the level in the way a person's eyes moved when they were running a tactical calculation, not a casual survey. He saw her. He stopped. She saw the dark stain spreading through the fabric beneath his hand, black in the fluorescent light, and understood what it was. Behind him, down the ramp, the second set of footsteps was getting louder. He looked at her. She looked at him. His jaw was set. His breathing was controlled in the specific way that people controlled breathing when controlling it was the only thing standing between them and something worse. "Go," he said. One word, low, not a request. Claire Whitmore, who had just lost everything she had spent 7 years building, who was sitting on a concrete divider in a soaked wedding dress with mascara tracking lines down her face, looked at this bleeding stranger and then looked at the ramp behind him and made a decision that would take her years to fully understand. She stood up, she smoothed her ruined dress, and then she walked directly toward the ramp, toward the footsteps, and when the first man in dark tactical gear rounded the corner and nearly ran into her, she grabbed his forearm with both hands and screamed, raw and full and completely real, because she had 600 witnesses worth of grief sitting in her chest, and it had to go somewhere. Screamed that she had been robbed, that they had taken her bag, that there was a man running down the stairs. The man in tactical gear hesitated. 1 second, 2. Behind her, she heard nothing. The bleeding stranger had moved. The men in tactical gear exchanged a look and went for the stairwell. Claire stood alone in the parking structure. The rain came through the open side of the building in a fine mist. She was shaking, not from cold, or not only from cold, and her hands, when she looked at them, had a small smear of blood across the left palm where she had grabbed the tactical gear man's arm and his weapon had shifted. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she heard a voice behind her, quiet and absolutely certain, the kind of voice that had never in its life been required to repeat itself. "Turn around slowly." She turned around. The bleeding man was leaning against a concrete pillar 8 feet away, his weapon lowered but present, his eyes on her with an intensity that had nothing performative in it, just assessment, pure and unblinking and very, very careful. "Why did you do that?" he said. It was not a question. It was the beginning of a calculation. Claire looked at him. Her mascara was ruined. Her dress was ruined. The morning she had been building toward for 7 years was rubble behind her, and she was standing in a parking garage with a bleeding criminal pointing a gun in her direction, and she felt, under the grief and the cold and the shaking, a terrible, inappropriate clarity. "I don't know," she said. "I just didn't want them to win." He studied her for another 3 seconds. Then he lowered the weapon entirely. He pulled something from his jacket pocket and pressed it against his side, and she realized it was a folded handkerchief, already dark with blood, being used to slow something it was not equipped to stop. "You're going to need to come with me," he said. "I don't even know who you are." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, but a kind of precision, the way a lens adjusted to bring a distant object into focus. "My name is Lucien De Luca," he said. The name landed in the fluorescent-lit air of that parking structure like a dropped structural beam. Claire Whitmore had lived in Chicago for 6 years. She had worked in buildings where men at the top of the finance world walked the hallways. She had sat in rooms where lawyers who charged $400 an hour spoke in careful euphemisms about certain clients and certain transactions. She knew that name. Everyone in this city knew that name. Lucienne DeLuca watched her face process the information with the patience of a man who had watched many faces do the same thing and was accustomed to the result. What he was not accustomed to, what shifted something in him, fractionally, in a way he would not examine for several weeks, was what happened next. Claire Whitmore pulled in a breath, squared her shoulders, looked him directly in the eye. "Okay," she said, "but I'm not getting in a car without knowing where we're going." Somewhere below them in the structure, a door slammed. Footsteps again. Different rhythm, different number, wrong direction. Lucienne DeLuca, the most feared man in Chicago, looked at this soaked, ruined, completely unintimidated woman in a wedding dress and said very quietly, "We don't have time to negotiate." He was already moving. And against every rational framework she had ever constructed for her own life, Claire Whitmore moved with him, leaving behind the dress that was supposed to mean everything, the name she was supposed to take, and the version of herself she had spent 7 years trying to become. Behind her, through the open side of the parking structure, the rain came down harder, and somewhere in the dark city beyond it, something had already begun. The car was black and moved through the rain like it had somewhere to be that the rain could not follow. Claire sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her wet dress pooling cold against the leather. There were 2 men in the front, the driver, who had not looked at her once, and a second man in the passenger seat with close-cropped hair and the neck of someone who lifted things professionally. Neither of them spoke. The city moved past the tinted windows in streaks of gray and yellow, traffic lights bleeding color through the wet glass, and Claire sat very still and tried to calculate what she had just done. The answer, when she arrived at it, was not comforting. Lucienne DeLuca was in the seat beside her. He had taken off his jacket somewhere between the parking structure and the car and pressed a folded cloth against the wound in his side, and he held it there with one hand, elbow resting on the door, with the ease of a man who had done this before. He had been on his phone for the first 4 minutes of the drive, speaking in a low, flat voice that carried no urgency because it did not need to. The urgency was implied. It lived in the spaces between his words like load-bearing structure inside a wall, invisible but absolute. He ended the call, looked at her. "You're an architect," he said. She turned her head. "How do you know that?" "You were registered as a guest, Callaway Wedding. Your name was on the seating chart." "You looked up the seating chart." "I looked up the venue. The guest list was attached." He said it the way someone said 2 + 2 = 4. A fact, not a justification. "Claire Whitmore. Whitmore Associates. Licensed since 26. You designed the Harmon Tower Edition." "The Harmon Tower Edition won a regional award." "I know. I was at the ceremony." Claire looked at him for a moment. There was something deeply wrong about this conversation, and not in the way that a conversation with a man who had recently been shot was wrong. That wrongness she had already cataloged and filed under current emergency. This was a different wrongness. The wrongness of realizing the room you were standing in was not the room you thought you had walked into. "Why were you at the ceremony?" she said. "I own 3 floors of that building." She turned back to the window. Outside, the city gave way to a stretch of the lakefront, the water invisible beyond the embankment, just a dark suggestion of scale and coldness. She thought about the Harmon Tower, the way the light hit the atrium at 2 in the afternoon. She had spent 11 months on that atrium. She thought about Ethan explaining that her obsession with natural light was inefficient. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere you'll be safe." That's not an answer. It's the answer available right now. He shifted against the seat. She heard the controlled quality of his breathing. Not labored, but managed, the way someone managed pain that was significant, but not yet critical. The men in that parking structure work for Vincent Marrow. He runs distribution operations on the South Side, and has been trying to formalize a reason to move on my organization for 6 months. Tonight, he found one. You. Me. Alive would have been useful to him. Dead would have been sufficient. He paused. You complicated his math. I complicated his math, Claire repeated. You bought me 40 seconds. In my line of work, 40 seconds is the difference between a problem and a funeral. The car turned onto a private drive that was not marked on any street Claire recognized. A gate opened. Iron, heavy, the kind of gate that was not decorative, and closed behind them. The property beyond it was set back from the street and large, the kind of large that didn't announce itself. No columns, no ostentatious landscaping, just space and glass, and the particular silence of serious money that had nothing left to prove. She registered it the way she registered every structure she encountered. Automatically, involuntarily, the professional reflex she could not turn off even in the middle of her own catastrophe. Clean lines, setback that maximized sightlines in every direction. The kind of building designed by someone who understood that vulnerability was architectural as much as it was personal. They brought her inside. A woman she did not know handed her dry clothes, dark, simple, practical, and pointed her to a bathroom off the main hall. Claire stood in front of the mirror for a long time after she had changed. The wedding dress was in a heap on the tile floor behind her. She did not look at it. Her face was a problem. The mascara had dried into something archaeological. She washed it off with cold water and stood at the sink and gripped the edge of the basin and let herself have 30 seconds of absolute silence in which she allowed the full weight of the morning to sit on her chest. 30 seconds. Then she straightened up and went back out. The main room of the house was designed for function rather than comfort, though the two overlapped in ways that were not accidental. Lucien was seated on a low couch with his shirt open, and a man who moved with the specific efficiency of medical training was working on his side. Claire did not look away. She sat in a chair across the room and watched because looking away felt like the wrong choice in a place where every choice was being evaluated. How bad? She said. Through and through, the medical man said, not to her. Is that good or bad? The medical man glanced at her. Lucien answered. Good. Means the bullet is not currently inside me. I know what through and through means. Then why ask? She didn't answer. Lucien's eyes moved to her face with the same quality of attention he had given her in the parking structure. Not warmth, not hostility, just the specific focus of someone conducting a continuous and extremely serious evaluation. You should call someone, he said. Your family will be looking for you. My phone is in the bridal suite. We can get it. I don't want it. A pause. The medical man worked quietly. Rain hit the windows in irregular patterns. The man who was supposed to marry you today, Lucien said. Ethan Calloway. Don't. His father is Harrison Calloway, Calloway Capital, 42 years in private investment, 14 funds, current assets under management of approximately $800 million. Claire was very still. I'm not asking, Lucien said. I'm telling you what I know, because in a few hours it's going to become relevant and you should know it before it does. What does Ethan's father have to do with any of this? Lucien looked at her. The medical man finished, pressed a bandage into place, and left the room without being asked. Lucien pulled his shirt closed, not buttoning it, just covering the work, and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and when he spoke his voice had a different quality. Still controlled, still certain, but underneath that certainty, something that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, something colder than either. Calloway Capital has been operating as a pass-through for laundering operations on behalf of the Morrow Network for approximately 3 years. I've known about it for 18 months. I have been building a case, a legal case, through proper channels, because there are advantages to doing things properly, that would have dismantled that arrangement and exposed everyone involved. He paused. 2 weeks ago, Harrison Calloway had a private meeting with Vincent Marrow. The content of that meeting was reported to me by a source I trust. The meeting was about one thing, how to remove my ability to move against them before I was ready. Claire's hands were cold in her lap. You were part of that, Lucien said. Not your decision, your name, your marriage. The Calloway family ties to your family's firm, the legal complications that would create, the leverage it gave certain people over your professional licenses and project financing if the marriage went forward as planned. He stopped. Or didn't go forward. The room was very quiet. Either way, he said, either outcome of that wedding served their purpose. Claire looked at him. She was aware of her own heartbeat. You're saying Ethan was supposed to... I'm saying Harrison Calloway needed that wedding to either happen or collapse publicly in a way that created maximum legal entanglement around you specifically. Because your firm has permits attached to 3 DeLuca-adjacent properties, and if your professional standing was compromised, those permits could be challenged and the building projects attached to them could be stalled for 18 months, which is all the time they need to complete the Marrow transfer and move the assets somewhere I can't reach. Claire sat with this for a moment. Outside, the rain had changed character. Lighter now, more persistent, the kind of rain that settled in for the duration. So Ethan, she said, and then stopped. Ethan is his father's instrument, Lucienne said. Whether he knows the full architecture of it or not, I can't tell you. She wanted to feel something clean about that. She wanted the knowledge that Ethan had been used the way she had been used to produce some kind of symmetrical relief, the way a structural problem found its solution in a mirror load. It did not produce that. What it produced was something considerably more complicated and considerably less comfortable, something that lived in the body rather than the mind, a tightening behind the sternum, a sensation like standing on a floor you have just been told is not load-bearing. Why are you telling me this? She said. Lucienne looked at her steadily. Because I need something from you. She almost laughed. She could feel the shape of a laugh forming somewhere under her breastbone. Not humor, but the specific hysteria of someone who had absorbed more information than their nervous system had good protocols for. Of course you do, she said. My organization has a succession agreement. He said it flatly, without preamble. Drawn up by my father, binding on every capo and lieutenant in the structure. A leadership transition requires a verified legal marriage, not a ceremony. A marriage license, filed and recorded. He paused. My father believed a man who could not manage a household could not manage an empire. I have disagreed with this position for 15 years. The agreement has not changed. Claire looked at him. There are 3 men in my organization who want control, he said. 2 of them would run it into the ground within 5 years. One of them has already made arrangements with the Marrow network that would turn everything my family built into a supply chain for people I have spent my adult life trying to contain. He stopped. The succession meeting is in 6 days. The silence stretched. No, Claire said. The arrangement would be contractual, clearly defined terms, duration, compensation, exit conditions. You would be... No. Claire, you don't get to say my name like we know each other. You don't get to sit there and tell me my entire life for the past 7 years was someone else's chess game and then immediately ask me to be a piece in yours. She was not shouting. She was careful about that. Her voice was level and precise, and it cost her something to keep it that way. I just left a parking structure where men with guns were trying to kill you. I am sitting in your house in clothes I didn't choose wearing a ring. She stopped, looked down. She had forgotten about the ring. The engagement ring Ethan had given her 2 years ago, which she had been wearing on automatic that morning, still on her left hand because she had not had the presence of mind to remove it. She pulled it off, set it on the table between them. Lucienne looked at it. She could not read what he was thinking. Your answer is no, he said. My answer is no. He nodded once. Then I'll have someone drive you wherever you need to go. She lasted 4 hours. Dana found her at a hotel near Midtown that Claire paid for in cash. Dana had cash, was the thing. Dana had shown up with cash and a rental car and the face of someone who had been ready for this for years and had the grace not to say so. And they sat on the bed and Claire told her everything. Not the parking structure, not Lucian. The part she could explain, the morning, the corridor, Ethan's voice, Margaret Calloway's face in the front row, watching without surprise. Dana listened. She did not say, I told you so. She said, What do you need right now? I need to know if what he said about Harrison Calloway is true. Dana looked at her. What who said? Claire didn't answer. She picked up the hotel phone. Dana had also brought her phone, retrieved from the bridal suite in a transaction Claire did not ask about, and she called Kenji at the firm. Kenji answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. The Harmon permits, she said. The DeLuca adjacent filings. If my license was challenged, how long would we have? Kenji went quiet in the way he went quiet when an answer was going to be complicated. Claire, what happened? Kenji. 45 days, he said. Maybe 60 if we filed extensions and got friendly ears at the board. But if there was a formal professional conduct complaint attached, it could be 30. She stared at the wall. Who filed the insurance on the Meridian Street project? Callaway Capital. Sub-underwriting through a firm I don't. Claire, why are you... Send me everything you have on the Callaway Capital connection to our permits, tonight. She hung up. Dana was watching her. Don't, Claire said. I'm not doing anything. You have a face. I have a concerned face. That's allowed. Claire stood up and went to the window. The rain had stopped. The city was wet and reflective, every surface throwing back the lights in long, distorted columns. She thought about the Harmon Tower atrium. She thought about 11 months of work on natural light. She thought about Ethan's voice in that corridor. It's more complicated than... And the specific, exhausted contempt she felt when she remembered it. She thought about Lucien DeLuca's hands. Not the gun. The hands. The way he had pressed the cloth against his own wound. The practical intimacy of it. The complete absence of drama. She thought about what he had said. The only unexpected moment was a woman buying 40 seconds she didn't have to buy. She picked up her phone. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting too, or told her nothing, because a man like that answered every call on the first ring. The terms, she said. I want them in writing before I agree to anything. I want my own lawyer to review it. I want a duration cap of 12 months maximum and a clean exit with zero legal encumbrance. I want my firm's permits protected as a condition, not a courtesy. And I want to know everything. Everything you know about what Callaway did. In writing, notarized, held by a third party of my choosing. A pause. 2 seconds. Agreed, Lucien said. I'm not finished. She turned from the window. Dana was watching her with wide eyes that she was clearly trying to keep neutral. I'm not a prop. I'm not a presence. If I'm in a room, I'm in the room. If there's a decision being made that involves my name, I'm at the table. Another pause. Slightly longer. Agreed, he said again. Then we need to meet tomorrow morning. She stopped. And bring something for the wound. You need to keep it compressed, or you're going to have a problem by the end of the week. She heard something on the other end of the line that was not quite a pause and not quite a sound. She could not identify it. It was the first thing about him she could not immediately categorize. 7 a.m., he said. I'll send a car. She hung up, looked at Dana. Dana opened her mouth. Don't, Claire said. I literally haven't said anything. You're going to. I'm going to say you've had the worst morning of your life and you're making a decision that is... It's not a decision, Claire said. It's a calculation. She set the phone down, picked up the engagement ring that she had brought, absently, from the hotel nightstand, the ring that Ethan had given her in a restaurant 2 years ago with his parents watching from 3 tables away and his mother filming it on her phone. She looked at it for a moment, then she set it on the nightstand face down. Go home, Dana. I'll call you tomorrow. Claire, please. It came out quieter than she intended. I need one night where no one is watching me figure this out, okay? Dana left. The room was quiet. The city reflected itself in the wet streets below. She met with his lawyer at 7 the next morning in a conference room that was not in any building she had permits for, and signed 3 documents that her own attorney, reached at 6 a.m., and bless him for it, had reviewed overnight and annotated in red pen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to high-stakes paperwork and minimum notice. She signed her name, and it felt like nothing, and like everything simultaneously. Lucien DeLuca was present, but not central. He sat at the end of the table and watched the process with the expression of a man observing engineering work. interested in the outcome, confident in the structure, not required to perform any particular emotion about it. He had changed his clothes. The wound was dressed properly. He looked in a light gray suit in a room full of lawyers, like exactly what he was. The most dangerous person in the building, and the only one who didn't need anyone to know it. After the documents were signed and the lawyers had filed into the corridor, he slid a box across the table toward her. Small. Flat. She opened it. A ring. Not ostentatious, not a gesture. A band of white gold with a single dark stone set flush. Functional. Architectural. The kind of ring that did not announce itself. She looked at it. "The old one was wrong," he said. Simply. She didn't ask how he knew what the old one looked like. She was beginning to understand that there was a great deal Lucien de Luca knew, and a smaller, more important set of things that he had chosen, specifically, not to know yet. She put it on. It fit. She did not examine how it fit. That was a question for another day. The first week inside the De Luca operation was like being handed the blueprints to a building that had been constructed over 60 years by 4 different architects who had never met and were working from 4 different sets of physics. There were layers she could identify and layers she could not. There were men who looked at her with flat hostility and men who looked at her with flat indifference. And one, a lieutenant named Saul, 50s, compact, the kind of quiet that had volume in it, who looked at her with something she gradually identified as provisional respect, the kind extended to someone who had not yet failed a test that had not yet been administered. Lucien moved through his own organization the way current moved through a circuit, not visible in itself, only in its effects. She watched him in meetings and watched him between meetings, and the difference was instructive. In meetings, still, precise, listening with the quality of attention that could make a man uncomfortable speaking inaccurately. Between meetings, the same, but with a fraction less performance in it, a fraction more of whatever was underneath. On the 4th day, she was in his office reviewing the property documentation for 3 buildings whose permits she was now technically on the hook for, when Saul came in without knocking and put a photograph on the desk. Lucien looked at it. His expression did not change. "When?" he said. "Last night," Saul said. "Harrison Calloway had dinner with Vincent Marrow at a private club in Kenwood. 3 hours. Our man says Marrow left happy." Claire looked up from the documents. Lucien looked at her. There was something in the look. Not quite warning, not quite assessment. A recalibration. "Ethan Calloway filed for an emergency permit review on the Meridian Street project this morning," Saul said, "through a third-party legal entity. The filing names Whitmore Associates as having a conflict of interest." He paused. It was filed at 6:45 a.m. before the courthouse opened. The room was very quiet. Claire put the documents down. She understood the architecture of it now, the complete load-bearing structure of what had been constructed around her. The engagement, the wedding, the public humiliation, the emergency filing. Each element not random, not cruel for cruelty's sake, but functional. Each piece carrying weight in a structure designed to put her exactly here. Only here was not where they had intended her to be. "They know," she said. Saul looked at her. "About the marriage," she said. "They know already." "Yes," Lucien said. "How fast did that get out?" "Within the hour of the courthouse filing." His voice was even. "We expected it. Which means the timeline for the succession meeting has moved up. 3 days? Not 6? She looked at him. He looked at her. The photograph of Harrison Calloway and Vincent Marrow sat on the desk between them. "And Ethan," she said. Lucien's jaw shifted slightly. Not anger, something more contained. "Ethan Calloway landed at O'Hare this morning from a flight out of Milan. He's been out of the country for 4 days. He was there when the permit filing was made." Milan. 4 days ago was the day after the wedding, the day after he had stood in front of 600 people and dismantled 7 years of her life in 90 seconds. He had gotten on a plane. She thought about that for a moment. The specific texture of it. The way someone could stand in a room and wreck everything in it, and then go somewhere else and order room service and not look back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Lucien looked at her. There was something in the look that she could not fully read yet. She was getting better at reading him, but the vocabulary was still incomplete. The succession meeting requires your presence, as my wife. At the table. The whole table. Yes. She thought about what that table would look like, what those men would look like looking at her. The weight of that room, the calculation in every set of eyes, the specific violence of being seen as the weakest point in someone else's structure. She thought about the permit filing, about Ethan on a plane to Milan, about Margaret Calloway's face in the front row, watching without surprise. She thought about the atrium in the Harmon Tower and the 11 months she had spent making the light work, and how Ethan had called it inefficient, and how the award had sat on a shelf in the firm's conference room, and she had walked past it every morning. She said yes, not out loud, not to Lucien, not to Saul, not to the photograph of Harrison Calloway sitting on the desk between them, like evidence at a trial that had not officially started yet. She said it inside, in the place where decisions actually happened before they became words. In the load-bearing structure of herself that had been holding weight for 29 years without anyone noticing the stress fractures. She picked up the permit documents she had set down. She set them in a neat stack. She looked at Lucien. "Tell me what the succession meeting looks like," she said. "Every person in the room. What they want. What they're afraid of. I need the full structural load before I can tell you where the weaknesses are." Lucien looked at her for a moment. That precise, unblinking quality of attention. And then he looked at Saul, and Saul left, closing the door behind him with the care of someone who understood that certain rooms required that kind of silence. Then Lucien began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. Not continuously. There were pauses, interruptions, moments where he stopped and looked at the middle distance in the way of someone recalculating while speaking, someone for whom information was not recited but actively reassembled each time it was required. Claire sat across from him with a legal pad and wrote nothing down because she did not need to. She had spent 11 years building spatial memory into a professional instrument, and what Lucien described was, at its core, a spatial problem. 6 men in a room, each occupying a defined position, each with load-bearing relationships to the others, each with a point of maximum stress that, if found and applied correctly, would determine the structural outcome of the entire assembly. 3 senior capos. A family attorney who had been managing the DeLuca succession documents for 30 years, and who was, Lucien said flatly, the most dangerous man in any room he entered because he understood the legal architecture better than anyone alive and had been known, on 2 separate occasions, to reinterpret that architecture in ways that served his own interests more than his clients'. 2 financial officers whose loyalty was technically to the organization, but practically to whichever outcome preserved their positions. And the 3 who want control, Claire said. Marco Reyes, 41. He runs the West Side distribution and thinks in straight lines. He's dangerous when cornered, but predictable when given an obvious path forward. Lucien turned a pen between 2 fingers. She had noticed this, the small economy of motion, when he was organizing thoughts. Felix Crane, 53. He's the one with the Morrow connection. He's been building toward this moment for 7 years, and he's patient, and he does not make obvious mistakes. And the 3rd, Lucien set the pen down. Dominic Vass, my cousin. He's 29. He grew up in this organization the same way I did. He knows every protocol, every relationship, every arrangement going back 20 years. He stopped. He also loves me, or believed he did, until approximately 3 months ago, when I declined to name him as my second. Why did you decline? Because he's brilliant and impulsive and doesn't know the difference between those 2 things yet. He said it without cruelty, clinically, the way someone stated a structural truth about a material. In 5 years, he'd be exceptional. In 3 days, he's a liability. Claire looked at the legal pad she had not written on. He's the most dangerous one. Lucien looked at her. Yes. Because the other 2 are enemies. He's a wound. A pause. Something moved in Lucien's face. Not surprise, but the fractional recalibration she was beginning to recognize as his version of it. Yes, he said again, and this time the word had a different weight. The courthouse filing went through on the 2nd day. Kenji called at 8 in the morning with the voice of someone who had not slept, and was attempting to sound like someone who had. The permit challenge on the Meridian Street project had been assigned to a review board with a 45-day timeline. The third-party entity that had filed, a shell company called Lattice Holdings LLC, incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago, had attached 17 documents to the challenge, several of which contained what Kenji described as selectively edited correspondence that made it appear Claire had known about and facilitated zoning irregularities on 2 other projects. "They're fabricated," Claire said. "I know they're fabricated. The review board doesn't know they're fabricated. And Claire," the letterhead. His voice went careful. "Some of the correspondence uses your firm's letterhead. Someone had access to your documents." She sat very still. "Who has access?" she said. "Current staff and past staff. And—" He stopped. "Kenji?" "Ethan. You gave him access to the firm's server 2 years ago for the Harmon Collaborative submission." She remembered it. A Tuesday afternoon. Ethan at her desk, asking for the login with the patience of someone who had never been told no and was not practicing now. She had given it to him without thinking, because he was going to be her husband, and in her version of the world that meant something. She ended the call. She sat in the chair in Lucian's office, the office that had become, in 4 days, a space she moved through with the ease of someone who had mapped it, which she had, because she mapped every space she occupied. It was the only thing she trusted about herself completely. And she looked at the window and the city beyond it, and felt something she could not name for a moment, and then named it precisely. She felt stupid, not hurt. That was already a completed transaction. Stupid. The specific scouring stupidity of realizing that the access you gave someone in good faith had been cataloged, preserved, and deployed against you with a specificity that required not just access, but planning. Ethan had not just been careless with her. He had been careful about certain things. Carefully careless. She got up and went to find Lucien. He was in a room on the 2nd floor that she had not been in before, a smaller room, almost bare, with a table and 3 chairs and a window that faced the interior courtyard. Saul was there, and a third man she did not know, compact and gray-haired, who looked at her entry with neither welcome nor objection. "The server access," she said, and stopped. She looked at the third man. "You can speak in front of Marcus," Lucien said. She told him about the letterhead, about Lattice Holdings, about 14 months, which was 6 months before she had started seriously planning the wedding, which was 8 months before Ethan had told her he loved her in a way he had not told her before. Newly tender, a recalibration she had registered without understanding. While she spoke, she watched Lucien's face. He listened with the stillness of a man receiving information he had partially expected and was now confirming against an internal model. When she finished, there was a silence, and in the silence she understood something. "You knew about the server access," she said. Lucien met her eyes. "I knew Calloway had compromised a professional contact. I did not know it was your firm's server specifically until 48 hours ago." 48 hours ago. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "I was waiting for confirmation before—" "Don't." Her voice came out flat. Not loud. Flat, the way a surface was flat when everything had been pressed out of it. "Don't tell me you are protecting me from incomplete information. I am not a load you manage. I am the person whose name is on those permits, whose career is being dismantled by documents that exist because I trusted someone, and you sat with that knowledge for 48 hours and said nothing." Lucien said nothing. "Say it was strategic," she said. "At least that would be honest." A long pause. "It was strategic," he said, "and it was wrong." The admission landed in the room with a weight she had not expected. She had expected deflection, not because she had read him as dishonest, but because she had read him as someone who organized the world according to tactical necessity and would apply that organization uniformly. The absence of deflection was, briefly, more disorienting than deflection would have been. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus. "Lattice Holdings," she said. "Who's the registered agent?" Marcus looked at Lucien. Lucien nodded. "Registered agent is a law firm in Delaware," Marcus said. "Clean front. but the filing signature on the permit challenge is notarized by a firm called Greystone Partners. They do regulatory work exclusively for 2 clients. He paused. Vincent Marrow's Hospitality Holdings and Callaway Capital. Claire looked at the table. She looked at the courtyard window. She thought about the specific geometry of what she was standing inside, the way every line of it converged, the way the forces distributed, the way a structure designed to collapse directed all its weight toward a single point. That point was her, not Lucian. Her. Her permits, her firm, her professional standing, her name on documents that could be weaponized in ways that created legal chaos around the DeLuca properties and bought Morrow and Callaway exactly the time they needed. The wedding was never about Ethan, she said. No, Lucian said. It was about my permits, the whole time, the engagement, the timeline. All of it was about getting my name attached to enough legal documentation that it could be pulled like a thread. Yes. She sat down. Not from weakness, from the need to think without her body being in the way. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Her hands were steady. She noticed that with something that was not quite satisfaction but was in the same neighborhood. The succession meeting is in 2 days, she said. Yes. Felix Crane has the Marrow connection. Crane needs Lucian's succession to fail. Morrow needs the permits challenged long enough to complete the asset transfer. And Harrison Callaway needs both of those things because he's underwater with Morrow, and the only way out is through. She stopped. They're all pulling the same thread. They just don't all know they're pulling it together. She looked up. Lucian was watching her with the focused intensity of someone watching a structure being assembled in real time, calculating tolerances as it rose. There's something else, Marcus said. She looked at him. He put a photograph on the table, different from the one of Harrison and Marrow. This one was blurrier, taken through glass, a restaurant interior, low light, 2 figures in a booth. One she recognized as Felix Crane from the file photographs Lucian had shown her. The other took her a moment. Then she had it. Dominic Vass. Lucian's cousin, 29 years old, brilliant and impulsive, who didn't know the difference. The wound. The photograph was time-stamped 11 days ago. Lucien had gone very still in the way that was different from his normal stillness. Not the stillness of controlled attention, but the stillness of something that had been hit and had not yet decided what to do about it. When did you get this? He said. This morning, Marcus said. The source sat on it for a week. Wasn't sure it was what it looked like. What does it look like? Claire said. Neither man answered immediately. She looked at Lucian. His jaw was set. His hands on the table were flat and very still. It looks like Dominic meeting with the man who wants to remove me 6 days before the succession meeting, Lucian said. His voice was even, completely even, the evenness of something under maximum load. It looks like my cousin making an arrangement. Tabat. She left them alone in the room because she understood that certain things required privacy, not from sensitivity but from function. A man did not process a wound of that particular shape in front of an audience without the processing becoming performance, and Lucien DeLuca was not a man who performed anything he did not intend to perform. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She stood at the counter and drank it and looked out the window at the courtyard and thought about structure, the way weight distributed through a system when one of the primary load-bearing members failed without warning, the way the rest of the structure responded, not with collapse, not immediately, but with redistribution, the forces finding new paths, stressing elements that had not been designed for that load. She was on her 3rd cup when Saul appeared in the doorway. He wants you back in. She put the cup down. Lucien was alone in the room. Marcus was gone. The photograph of Dominic and Crane was still on the table, face up. I need to know something, Lucian said without preamble, and I need you to answer it directly. Ask. When you agreed to this arrangement, the contract, the ring, everything, what did you think you were doing? She looked at him. It was not the question she had expected. I thought I was making a calculation, she said. I thought I was taking the one available action that protected my work and put me somewhere with more information than I had standing in a parking structure in a wet wedding dress. And now I think the calculation was right, and the variables are worse than I estimated. She paused. That's not unusual in construction. You design for the loads you can measure. Then the ground shifts. Lucien looked at the photograph. Dominic has access to the succession protocols, every procedural requirement, every verification step. If he's aligned with Crane, he stopped. If Crane has the succession protocols, the meeting in 2 days isn't a meeting. It's a prepared outcome. Can you prove the photograph? Proving it and using it are two different problems. What do you need to use it? A corroborating source. Someone inside Crane's operation who can confirm the meeting was substantive and not coincidental. Do you have a source inside Crane's operation? Lucien looked at her. There it was again. That fractional shift. The thing she still did not have full vocabulary for. I had one, he said. Past tense as of this morning. My source went dark 40 minutes before Marcus brought me the photograph. The silence was dense. Someone told Crane you had a source, she said. Yes. Someone who knew. 4 people knew. His voice was absolutely flat. Myself, Marcus, Saul, and Dominic. She sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it. A man who had been running an empire for a decade, who had survived Vincent Marrow and Harrison Calloway, and a gunshot wound in a parking structure, sitting across from her with a photograph that proved his cousin had walked into the enemy's room and sold the one asset that could not be replaced. Does Dominic know you know? She said. Not yet. When does he find out? The moment I act on it. And if you act on it before the meeting, Crane knows his timeline is compromised and moves up the action. Yes. And if you don't act on it, you walk into a room in 2 days where the protocols have been handed to the other side and the outcome is already written. Yes. She picked up the photograph. She looked at it. Dominic Vass's face in the low restaurant light, leaning forward across the table with the body language of someone making an offer, and Felix Crane's face opposite, the expression of a man receiving it. She thought about something Lucien had said on the first night. The only unexpected moment was a woman buying 40 seconds she didn't have to buy. 40 seconds. The difference between a problem and a funeral. I need access to the succession documents, she said. Claire, the full architectural record of how the meeting runs, every procedural requirement from your father's agreement, every verification step that Marcus said Dominic knows. She set the photograph down. Because the only way to use that meeting instead of surviving it is to understand the structure well enough to redesign it on the fly. And I redesign structures for a living. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent light of the parking structure felt very far away. Everything from 4 days ago felt very far away. The wet dress, the cold concrete, the 40 seconds she had spent buying without knowing who she was buying them for. The documents are in the 3rd drawer of the desk in the main office, he said, under the property surveys. She stood up. I'll need 4 hours. You have 2. Then I'll need coffee. Ma'am. She had been working for 90 minutes when Saul appeared in the doorway of the main office, and she knew from the quality of his stillness. She was learning to read the gradations of stillness in this house, the way each man's silence had a different texture, that something had happened. Ethan Calloway is outside, Saul said. She looked up from the documents. Outside this property, she said. At the gate. On foot. He's alone. Saul paused. He has a cut above his left eye, and he's not wearing a coat. She looked at the documents. The succession protocols spread across the desk like an architectural drawing, the load paths visible to her now in a way they had not been 90 minutes ago, the vulnerabilities mapped and noted. She stood up. Where's Lucien? She said. On a call. He doesn't know yet. Keep it that way. She stopped. For 5 minutes. Saul looked at her with the expression he had been carrying since the first day. Provisional respect, the test that had not been administered, and nodded once. Ethan was at the gate. He looked like something that had been processed badly and returned to original form imperfectly. The tuxedo shirt was gone, replaced by a dark jacket that was somebody else's. The cut above his eye was not deep, but it was recent, and his hands were shaking in a way he was trying to conceal by keeping them in his pockets. She stood on the inside of the gate and looked at him through the iron. The distance between them was 6 feet and several years, and the specific, irreversible distance of a man who had stood in front of 600 people and said what he had said. "Claire," his voice was rough, "I need to talk to you." "You're talking. Not like this. Can you, I'm not opening the gate, Ethan." He ran a hand through his hair. It was a gesture she recognized, the precursor to something he was working up the courage to say. She had spent 7 years learning the vocabulary of this man's body, and the knowledge sat in her now with the cold uselessness of a specialized tool for a job that no longer existed. "My father," he started. "Claire, I didn't know everything. I want you to know that. I knew about Lillian. I knew the wedding was... I knew it was wrong. I knew for months, and I couldn't figure out how to..." He stopped. "I thought if I just let it happen naturally, if it just fell apart on its own, you thought if you were cowardly enough, long enough, you wouldn't have to be responsible for the outcome," she said. "That's not a defense, Ethan. That's just a description." He flinched. "My father met with someone last night, in our house. I heard things. I wasn't supposed to be there. I came back early from..." He stopped again. He looked at the gate between them, and she could see him deciding whether to step forward or back, and she watched the decision without helping him make it. "They're not going to wait for the permit review. Morrow has people. Tonight. This address." The words landed in the cold air and sat there. "How many people?" she said. I heard numbers. I heard a time. Midnight." His voice cracked slightly on the word, and he pressed his mouth together hard. And she recognized that too, the specific compression of a man who was holding himself together by the thinnest structural margin. "Claire, I'm telling you because I know what I did to you is..." "Stop," she said it quietly. "If you tell me this was about love, I will walk back inside that house, and you can stand here until midnight and deal with whatever comes through that gate yourself." Ethan shut his mouth. "Good," she said. "Now tell me exactly what you heard." She brought him inside because the alternative was leaving a liability outside a gate that needed to stay secure. And Lucien, who had ended his call and been informed by Saul in the 2-minute window between Ethan arriving and Claire bringing him through the entrance, received the information with the particular quality of controlled anger that she was learning to distinguish from his other controlled states. The three of them stood in the main room, and it was the most uncomfortable geometry Claire had occupied since standing at the head of a wedding aisle in front of 600 people, and it was uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. Lucien looked at Ethan the way you looked at a structure that had been built wrong and was now someone else's problem to assess. "Midnight," Lucien said. "That's what I heard," Ethan said. He was doing better now that he was inside. The shaking was reduced to a faint tremor that showed only when he was still. He did not look at Claire directly. He looked at a point slightly above and to the left of her, the geometric cowardice of a man who could not look at the damage he had done. "How many?" 6, maybe 8. My father said enough to make it clean." He swallowed. He said Morrow wanted the wife first, as a message. The room was absolutely silent. Claire did not look at Lucien. She did not need to. She could feel the quality of his attention shift the way you felt a load redistribute in a structure. Not visible, not audible, just present, a change in the pressure of the air. "The wife," Lucien said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been before. That was the most frightening thing about it. "My father's words," Ethan said quickly. "I'm telling you what he..." "I heard you." Lucien turned to Claire. "Get the documents off the desk. Put them in the blue file. There's a car in the lower garage. Marcus has the keys. You're going to..." "I'm not leaving," she said. "Claire, I'm not leaving." She looked at him steadily. "I've been looking at your succession documents for 90 minutes. I know where the vulnerabilities are. I know what Crane has and what he's going to do with it, and I know, Lucien, I know how to turn it, but not if I'm in a car somewhere." He looked at her. The quality of the look was different from anything he had directed at her before, Duck. Not tactical assessment, not recalibration. Something rawer than that. Something that did not have the controlled quality of his other expressions. "The meeting is in 2 days," she said. "Midnight tonight is designed to make sure we never get there. She turned to the documents on the desk. So we need to not be here at midnight. I have people. Your people are good at this building. They know this building. She looked at him. So does Morrow, which is why he's sending 8 people. We need to not be in the building they're sending 8 people to. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Where? She thought about the succession documents, the property surveys underneath them. The 3 buildings whose permits bore her name, each one a DeLuca-adjacent property, she knew better than anyone in this room because she had designed the modifications to 2 of them and reviewed the structural surveys on all 3. I know a building, she said, and I know it in a way that none of Morrow's people do, and none of Crane's people do. And with the right 48 hours, I can turn that knowledge into the kind of advantage that doesn't require 8 men to answer. She looked at Ethan. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that might have been, in another context, awe, and was in this context simply the face of a man seeing clearly for the first time something he had spent 7 years refusing to look at directly. You're going to help us, she said to him. Not because you owe me, though you do, because your father used you the same way he used me, and the only difference is you had a choice at several points along the way, and you made the wrong one every time. This is a different point. Make a different choice. Ethan looked at the floor. Then he looked up. What do you need? Everything your father told Morrow about this address. Every detail. Who he spoke to. What language he used. What time the call was made. She turned back to Lucian. If we move in the next 2 hours, they arrive at an empty house. That buys us through tomorrow. And tomorrow I need to be inside the Alderman building on West Kinsey. The structural survey for the East Annex is filed under my firm's permit, and there's a secondary floor plan that exists only in my original drawings that no one else has ever seen. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hour. Then he said, 2 hours. 2 hours, she confirmed. She walked back to the desk and picked up the succession documents and the property surveys beneath them. And she put them in the blue file Lucian had mentioned without being told which one it was, because she had already mapped this room and she knew exactly where it sat. Behind her, she heard Lucien speak to Saul in a low voice, and she heard the machinery of the house begin to move. Doors, footsteps, the low specific sounds of a structure reconfiguring itself around a new load condition. She did not look back. She had work to do, and 2 hours to do it, and somewhere across the city a man named Felix Crane was sitting with protocols he believed were going to hand him everything, and a man named Harrison Calloway was making calls he believed were going to end her, and Dominic Vass was carrying a betrayal he believed was still secret. None of them had accounted for her. That, Claire Whitmore understood, was the only structural advantage she had, and she had spent her entire career building with less. They left at 11:17, 3 cars, different directions, the kind of dispersal that was designed to make surveillance arithmetic impossible. Claire was in the second car with Lucien and Saul, the blue file on her lap, the succession documents and her own hand-drawn floor plans of the Alderman building folded inside with the care she gave to drawings that had no copies. The city moved past the windows wet and indifferent. She had not slept. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the cold, as a condition of the environment rather than a problem requiring immediate solution. Lucien was on his phone for the first 8 minutes. She did not listen to the calls. She opened the blue file and looked at the floor plan of the Alderman Building's East Annex. Her own lines, her own notations, the secondary structural survey she had commissioned 18 months ago, when the DeLuca Property Management Company had asked her firm to assess expansion viability. The survey had revealed something that was not in the original building record: a decommissioned service corridor running the full length of the East Annex's sub-basement, sealed in the 1987 renovation but structurally intact, accessible from 2 points that existed on no current city filing. She had noted it, filed it, kept the original drawings. Nobody else had those drawings. That was the 40 seconds. That was the thing she had been given instead of a wedding and a husband and the life she had been building toward. And she was going to use it the way she used everything, precisely, without sentiment, to bear the load that was currently on the table. Lucien ended his last call. He looked at the floor plan in her hands. "Walk me through it," he said. She walked him through it. "Bant, The Alderman building was 6 stories of pre-war industrial construction on West Kinsey, the kind of building that Chicago had dozens of. Brick and steel and the specific gravity of a structure that had survived a century by being too solid to bother demolishing. The DeLuca Management Company held the lease on the top 2 floors. The lower 4 were divided among a logistics firm, an architectural studio that was not Claire's, and 2 floors of storage that had been vacant for 8 months. They arrived at 12:40. Morrow's people had hit the house on the north side at midnight, 12 minutes after the last car had cleared the gate. Saul had confirmation of this from a contact 2 blocks away. 8 men, professional entry, 40 seconds inside before they understood the building was empty. The contact reported controlled withdrawal. No pursuit. 8 men. 40 seconds. The number sat in Claire's chest with a specific texture. The Alderman building's loading dock entrance was unlocked with a key that Marcus produced from a ring of perhaps 30 keys, with the ease of a man for whom this was ordinary administration. They went in through the dock, up a freight elevator that groaned with the authentic complaint of machinery that had been working since before any of them were born, and into the 6th floor through a door that opened onto a space Claire had stood in twice before. It was large and mostly empty. The DeLuca Management Company used it for document storage and the occasional meeting that required the specific privacy of a building that did not appear in anyone's current operational intelligence. There were folding tables, metal chairs, fluorescent overheads that buzzed at the same frequency as the parking structure had, and that Claire registered with the disoriented clarity of exhaustion. A bathroom with a functional sink. A window that faced east and would produce light in approximately 5 hours. They set up. She spread the floor plan on the largest table. Lucienne stood opposite her. Saul and Marcus took positions near the door with the practiced ease of men who secured rooms the way other men breathed, automatically, without requiring a decision. Ethan sat against the far wall with his knees up and his head back and the expression of a man who had run out of useful things to feel and was waiting for instructions. The succession meeting, Claire said, is scheduled for the DeLuca firm's registered legal address, a conference suite at the Carver Building on Michigan Avenue, 14 floors up, 1 entrance on the main floor, 1 service entrance in the basement, both of which Crane's people have had 14 months to assess. She put her finger on the Alderman building floor plan. We're not going there. Lucienne looked at her. The succession agreement, she said, requires a witnessed meeting in a legally registered DeLuca property. It does not specify which property. She looked up. This building is registered to DeLuca Property Management, LLC. It qualifies. Saul made a sound that was not quite a word. Lucienne was very still. Crane's people are set up for the Carver Building, she said. They have the entrance points, the elevator access, whatever arrangement Dominic gave them about the internal protocols. If the meeting moves here at 8 hours' notice, none of that preparation transfers. She paused. And in this building, I know things they don't. The sub-basement corridor, Lucienne said. Among other things. She pulled out the secondary survey. The East Annex has a structural quirk in the 4th floor. A load transfer beam that was added in 1962 and never properly documented in the city record. The room directly above it resonates. Specific frequencies travel through the beam in ways that are not intuitive unless you know the physics. She looked at him. I know the physics. You're saying you can hear through the building. I'm saying I know exactly where to put a person to hear everything said in the room below without being in that room. She set the survey flat. Crane brings his people. They take positions they've prepared. They think they know the building. They don't know this building. And when the moment comes, when Crane makes his move with the protocols Dominic handed him, we know it before he deploys it, and we have a response that uses the architecture against him. Lucienne looked at the survey for a long time. She could see him running it. The load calculations of a different kind of structure, the weight of variables, the stress points. Dominic will be there, he said. His voice was even. It cost him something to keep it even. She could see that now. Yes. And when Dominic understands that I know, he'll have a choice to make, she said. In front of everyone. That's the point. She slept for 3 hours on a folded, moving blanket against the east wall, because her body made the decision unilaterally somewhere around 3 a.m., and she had learned in the last 5 days to spend less energy arguing with physical reality. She woke to gray light through the east window and the sound of Lucien on the phone again, and for one disoriented second between sleep and full consciousness, she forgot everything that had happened, and the sound of his voice in the gray morning light was simply a voice, low and certain, and the room was simply a room. Then she remembered. It took perhaps 4 seconds. Then she got up. Ethan was awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that Marcus must have procured from somewhere, staring at the floor plan with the expression of a man reading a document in a language he did not speak. She poured coffee from the same source, a thermos, practical, black, and sat down across from him. They did not speak for a moment. "He's not what I thought he was," Ethan said. He meant Lucien. He said it without inflection, a simple recalibration. "No," Claire said. "I thought—" He stopped. "My father always said the DeLuca operation was—" "Your father needed you to believe certain things," she said. "It made you easier to use." Ethan wrapped both hands around the cup. "Claire, I'm sorry." She looked at him. She had been waiting for this, she realized, or not waiting for it. She had been aware it was coming the way you were aware of a weather system on the radar, tracking it without urgency. The apology sat in the air between them, and she looked at it with the same assessment she brought to everything. "I know," she said. "It doesn't fix the permits. It doesn't fix the letterhead. It doesn't fix 600 people." She paused. "But I know." He nodded. He did not push further. That was the first correct thing she had seen him do in longer than she could accurately calculate, and she noted it and moved on. The calls went out at 7 a.m. Lucien made them personally, to each of the 3 capos, to the family attorney, to the 2 financial officers. Location change. Alderman Building, 6th floor, 9 a.m. The language was neutral and absolute in the way that Lucien's language was always neutral and absolute, and she sat at the far end of the table and listened to him make 6 calls in 14 minutes, and thought about the specific skill of a man who could communicate complete authority without raising his voice once. The family attorney, the one Lucien had described as the most dangerous man in any room, called back 3 minutes after the last outgoing call. Claire could hear his voice through the phone from 4 feet away. He was not happy about the change. Lucien listened to the unhappiness for approximately 12 seconds. Then he said, "The agreement specifies a registered DeLuca property. This is a registered DeLuca property. I'll see you at 9, and ended the call. She looked at him. "He'll tell Crane," she said. "Within 5 minutes," Lucien Yan agreed, which gives Crane 2 hours to reposition, not enough time to do it properly. He looked at her. "That's the window." They came at 8:40. Not Crane, not yet. Morrow's people first, 4 of them, a pre-meeting security sweep that announced itself by the way the freight elevator moved at 8:39 when no one had called it. Saul heard it from the stairwell door. He came back into the 6th floor room with 2 words. 4. Armed. Claire was already at the floor plan. "Loading dock stairwell," she said. "It comes out behind the service partition on the west side. If they're doing a sweep, they'll clear west to east." She traced the path with 1 finger. "That takes them past the 4th floor transfer beam. The acoustics there. Anything above a normal speaking voice travels up through the southeast corner of this room." She looked at Saul. "Put someone there, not to engage, to listen." Saul looked at Lucien. Lucien nodded. Marcus went. They waited. At 8:51, Marcus came back. "They cleared 4 floors, they're satisfied. 2 stayed on 2, 2 went back to the street." "Holding the exits," Lucien said. "Yes." "How many does Crane bring to a meeting like this?" Claire asked. "Typically 4. Today?" Lucien paused. "Today he'll bring more." "How many more?" "Enough to make a point." She understood what that meant. She looked at the floor plan. She looked at the secondary survey. She looked at the decommissioned service corridor in the subbasement and the 2 access points that existed on no current city filing. "Then we use the corridor," she said. Crane arrived at 9:04 with 6 men. Claire heard them from the 6th floor. The elevator, the footsteps, the specific distribution of weight across the old flooring that she had mapped in her mind the way she mapped every structure she occupied. 6 men plus Crane was 7. The family attorney arrived 2 minutes later with an assistant. The capos arrived in sequence over the following 8 minutes, each with 1 or 2 accompanying bodies. Dominic Vass arrived last. She heard his footsteps differently from the others, not because they were physically distinct, but because she was listening for them specifically, because Lucien had gone very still the moment the elevator moved for what he knew was the last time, and his stillness had its own acoustic quality. Dominic came through the door and looked at the room, and then looked at Lucien, and something moved across his face that Claire caught from her position at the table's edge. A micro-adjustment, a recalculation, the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting a specific geometry and found it altered. He looked at Claire. She looked back. She watched him decide that she was the variable, that whatever had changed, she was the reason for it. She could see the logic assembling behind his eyes. The contract marriage, the architect, the woman who had no reason to be in this room except that Lucien had put her there. And what did it mean that Lucien had put her there? What did it mean for the protocols Crane was holding? Dominic sat down 2 seats from Lucien. His jaw was set. His hands on the table were composed. He was 29 years old and brilliant and impulsive, and he did not know the difference. And right now the difference was the only thing that mattered. The family attorney, Harlan Fitch, silver-haired, 71 years old, with the eyes of a man who had been the most dangerous person in many rooms and intended to remain so, called the meeting to order with the efficiency of someone who charged by the hour and had been doing this for 3 decades. He read from the succession agreement. He outlined the verification requirements. He looked at Claire once, over the top of his reading glasses, with an assessment that was so complete and so rapid, it felt like a physical event. Then Felix Crane spoke. "Before verification proceeds," Crane said, "I want to raise a procedural question about the validity of the marriage registration." His voice was smooth, prepared, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this specific sentence. Specifically, the timeline of the registration relative to the succession notice and whether the marriage meets the agreement's requirement for... "The marriage was registered 8 days ago," Fitch said without looking up from the documents. "The succession notice was filed 6 days ago. The timeline is compliant." Crane smiled. It was the smile of a man who had expected this answer. "I'm aware of the registration date. My question concerns the circumstances of the registration. Specifically, whether the marriage was entered into under duress or material misrepresentation, which, under the agreement's validity clause, would constitute grounds for..." "On what basis?" Lucien said. Quietly. 2 words. "On the basis of documented evidence that the marriage was contracted within hours of a public incident involving Ms. Whitmore, while she was in a compromised emotional state, at a location that..." "I'll answer that," Claire said. The room looked at her. She had not planned to speak at this moment. The plan had involved listening, positioning, waiting for the specific procedural move that Crane intended to make with Dominic's protocols. But Crane's argument had a structural flaw that she could see from here, and in her experience, the right moment to address a structural flaw was the moment you identified it, not the moment someone else's timeline permitted. "I'm a licensed architect with 11 years of professional practice and a current standing with the Illinois State Licensing Board," she said. Her voice was level, not loud, precise. "I reviewed the succession agreement in full prior to the marriage registration. I retained independent legal counsel who reviewed it with me. The marriage was entered into with full information, full consent, and complete legal representation." She looked at Crane. "If you have documented evidence suggesting otherwise, I'd like to see the documentation." Crane's smile did not waver. He reached into the folder in front of him and removed 3 pages and slid them across the table toward Fitch. Fitch looked at them. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A fractional shift, the kind of shift that Claire had learned in the last 6 days to read in men who were accustomed to controlling their surfaces. He looked at the pages for 12 seconds. Then he set them down. "These are correspondence documents bearing the letterhead of Whitmore Associates," Fitch said. purporting to establish a prior professional relationship between Ms. Whitmore and Mr. DeLuca's property management company that predates the marriage by 14 months. He looked at Crane over his reading glasses. You're arguing a conflict of interest. I'm arguing a coordinated arrangement disguised as a spontaneous marriage, Crane said, which would constitute material misrepresentation under the validity clause and void the succession claim entirely. He leaned back, satisfied, the body language of a man watching a prepared outcome deploy on schedule. The room was very quiet. Dominic was looking at the table. Claire reached into the blue file. She had pulled the Lattice Holdings documentation at 4 a.m, the Delaware Incorporation records, the notarization signature from Greystone Partners, the filing timestamps that Kenji had sent her overnight, the IP registration data that Marcus had obtained through a channel she had not asked about. She had assembled them in order. She set them on the table in front of Fitch. The letterhead documents Mr. Crane just submitted were fabricated using server access obtained under false pretenses from my firm's system 26 months ago, she said. The notarization on those documents comes from a firm called Greystone Partners, which performs regulatory work exclusively for Morrow Hospitality Holdings and Callaway Capital. The entity that filed the permit challenge using the same fabricated documents, Lattice Holdings LLC, was incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago, which is 6 months before I was introduced to anyone in this room. She looked at Crane. The documents you just handed to Mr. Fitch were prepared before I ever met Lucien DeLuca, which means they couldn't have been prepared in response to the marriage. They were prepared in anticipation of it. She paused. Which means someone in this room knew this succession meeting was coming before Lucien announced it, and the only people who knew the succession timeline. She looked at Dominic. The room looked at Dominic. Dominic's hands on the table were very still. Crane moved first, not toward Claire, he was smarter than that, but toward Fitch, a hand extended, a repossessing gesture, reaching for the documents she had set down. Lucien's hand came down on top of them first. The room froze. Crane looked at Lucien's hand on the documents. Then he looked at Lucien's face. The calculation in his eyes ran fast. She could almost see it. The tactical arithmetic of a man assessing whether the moment had arrived or whether the moment had passed, whether the men he had positioned in this building were an asset or a liability, whether the protocols Dominic had given him were still operative or had been burned. Felix, Lucien said. His voice was the quietest thing in the room. Look at me. Crane looked at him. It's done, Lucien said. Crane's jaw tightened. 1 second, 2. The calculation ran its course and arrived at its conclusion, and Crane leaned back in his chair with the controlled movement of a man executing a retreat and trying to make it look like a pause. Then Dominic spoke. The protocols I gave him are clean, Dominic said. His voice was stripped of everything. No performance, no strategy, just the raw acoustic of a man who had run out of room. He was looking at Lucien. Only at Lucien. I want you to know that. I didn't give him anything that could hurt the organization. I gave him procedure, paper. I thought... He stopped. His throat moved. I thought if the meeting failed on a technicality, it would reset the timeline and I'd have more time to... To what? Lucien said. The question was not angry. That was the thing. There was no anger in it. There was something older and more serious than anger, something that lived in the part of a person that formed before they knew language. Dominic looked at him. 29 years old, brilliant and impulsive, and not knowing the difference. His eyes were wet, which he was not going to let become tears, and the effort of that was visible in every muscle of his face. To make you change your mind, Dominic said. The room was silent for a long time. Outside the east window, the Chicago morning was in full progress. Traffic, wind off the lake, the specific sound of a city that had been running on its own momentum since before anyone in this room was born and would continue running after all of them were done with whatever they were doing here. Fitch set down his pen. He looked at the documents Claire had provided. He looked at the documents Crane had provided. He looked at them with the eyes of a man who had been the most dangerous person in many rooms and understood, with complete professional clarity, which set of documents was going to determine the next 30 years of his practice. He picked up Claire's documents. Crane's chair scraped back. The two men Crane had positioned nearest the door moved at the same time. And at the same time, the door at the far end of the room opened, and Marcus came through it. And the door to the service stairwell opened, and two men Claire had not been introduced to came through that. And the specific geometry of the room rearranged itself in the space of 4 seconds into something that Crane's people had not prepared for, because they had prepared for the Carver building, not this building. And this building had a service stairwell that came out in a location that did not appear on any current city filing. Crane stood up. He was looking at the redistribution of bodies in the room with the expression of a man watching a structure fail in a direction he had not modeled. He looked at Claire. She met his eyes. "The building knew," she said. It was not a speech. It was not a threat. It was simply the most accurate sentence available, and she was a person who valued accuracy. And Crane's face in the moment, he understood what had happened. The corridor, the positions, the floor plan that existed only in her original drawings was the face of a man comprehending that he had lost to an architect in a building she understood better than he ever could have known to prepare for. Crane sat back down. He did it slowly, with the controlled movement of a man choosing surrender over spectacle. Because he was smart enough to understand that spectacle in this room, in this moment, with these bodies positioned at these doors, would produce only one outcome, and it would not be recoverable. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at Fitch. "Proceed," he said. It was the only word available to him, and he used it with the economy of a man who had nothing left to spend. Fitch proceeded. The verification took 22 minutes. He read from the agreement. He examined the marriage certificate, the registration documentation, Claire's legal counsel's notarized attestation. He examined the fabricated letterhead documents Claire had provided with the Greystone Partners notarization and the Lattice Holdings Incorporation records, and he set them aside with the deliberate placement of a man removing a structural element that had failed load testing. He asked Claire 2 questions directly. She answered them directly. He wrote something in the margin of the agreement. Then he looked at the room. "The succession is valid," he said. "Mr. DeLuca meets all conditions as specified in the agreement dated 11 years prior. The marriage is compliant. The documentation is compliant." He looked at Crane. "The challenge is dismissed." Crane did not move. The capos signed in sequence. The financial officers signed. Fitch signed and dated and capped his pen and closed the folder with the finality of a man who had just done the last significant work of a long career and knew it. Lucian signed last. He did not look at the pen or the paper when he signed. He looked at Dominic. Dominic was still in his chair, both hands on the table, looking at the surface of it. He had not signed anything. He had not been asked to sign anything. He was present in the room the way a load-bearing element was present after the load had been redistributed, technically still standing, functionally altered, the question of what happened next not yet answered. Lucien stood. The room stood with him. The capos, Marcus, Saul, the bodies at the doors, the whole assembled weight of it rising in the particular way that things rose around this man. He looked at Dominic for a long moment. "Come see me tomorrow," he said. "Alone." Dominic looked up. His eyes were dry now. Whatever he had been holding together was still holding. He nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was not condemnation. It was something more durable than either. The specific acknowledgement that the story between them was not finished, had not been finished here, would require a different room and a different conversation and more time than either of them had today. Crane left without speaking. His men left with him. The room emptied in stages until it was Lucien and Claire and Saul and the blue file and the morning light coming hard and flat through the east window. Claire looked at the floor plan still spread on the table, her own lines, her own notations, the secondary corridor that no one else had known existed until she needed it to exist in a way that mattered. Lucien looked at her. She looked back. "It held," she said, meaning the building, meaning the structure, meaning everything she had built in the last 48 hours out of documents and architecture and the specific 40 seconds worth of nerve she had first spent in a parking garage on the worst morning of her life. Lucien looked at her with the expression she still did not have complete vocabulary for. the one that had been assembling itself across 6 days of rooms and decisions and the particular grammar of two people learning each other under maximum pressure. Yes, he said. It held. Outside, Chicago ran its continuous and different morning, and somewhere across the city, Harrison Calloway's phone was about to ring with news he had not prepared for, and the thread they had been pulling since before she had known any of their names was about to pull back. Harrison Calloway's phone rang at 10:43 in the morning. He was in the study of his Gold Coast townhouse, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed photographs of 3 governors and a senator and himself shaking hands with men who had mattered. And he was on his 2nd cup of coffee and his 4th contingency call of the morning because the night operation had returned empty and Crane had not yet reported from the succession meeting, and the silence from both directions had the specific texture of a silence that was not going to resolve into good news. He answered on the 3rd ring. It was not Crane. It was a federal investigator named Sophia Reyes, and she introduced herself with the flat efficiency of someone who had made this particular kind of call many times and had long since stopped experiencing it as dramatic. She informed Harrison Calloway that a federal warrant had been issued for the search of Calloway Capital's offices and digital records. She informed him that 3 of his senior financial officers had been contacted directly and that 2 of them had already agreed to preliminary interviews. She informed him that the investigation concerned wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, that the evidentiary package that had triggered the warrant had been compiled over an 18-month period and included notarized documentation, digital transaction records, and a corroborating witness testimony filed the previous evening. Harrison Calloway listened to all of this without speaking. When she finished, he said, "I'll need to contact my attorney." "Of course," Sophia Reyes said. "We'll expect you at the federal building at 2 p.m. If you'd like to discuss the terms of voluntary cooperation before then, my number is—" He ended the call. He sat in the chair with the mahogany desk in front of him, and the photographs of governors and senators on the wall, and the 2nd cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he looked at the room around him with the expression of a man seeing the load-bearing walls of his life fail in sequence, each one taking the next with it, the progressive collapse of a structure that had been built on a foundation that had always been wrong. He thought about Claire Whitmore in a wedding dress at the head of his son's aisle. He thought about the way he had watched her walk out and felt nothing except the clean satisfaction of an operational step completing on schedule. He thought about what a serious miscalculation felt like. It felt like this. Oops. Ethan found out about the warrant from a news alert on his phone at 11:15, sitting in a rented room in a hotel near the river that he had paid for himself with a credit card that was his alone, not connected to any Calloway Capital account, because sometime in the previous 36 hours, he had developed the instinct, late and insufficient but present, to put distance between himself and every structure his father had built. He sat on the edge of the bed and read the alert twice. Then he called the number Claire had given him, not her personal number, the number Saul had passed through as a channel, and when no one answered, he left a message that said, "I'm going to the federal building voluntarily. I have documentation. I kept records of everything my father asked me to do because some part of me always knew." He paused. "I don't know if that matters, but I have them." He ended the call. He sat there for a moment longer. Then he got his coat and his records and he went. The federal building interview room smelled like recycled air and the specific institutional neutrality of a space designed to make everyone equally uncomfortable. Ethan sat across from 2 investigators for 4 hours and 40 minutes, and he told them everything he knew, which was more than he had admitted knowing even to himself. And the process of saying it aloud in a room with recording equipment and people writing things down had the quality of a controlled demolition, loud, structured, and irreversible, each admission taking the next section of wall with it until there was nothing left standing except the foundation, which turned out to be smaller and less impressive than the building had suggested. He did not see his father. Harrison Calloway arrived at the federal building at 2:07 p.m. with 3 attorneys and the bearing of a man who intended to manage the situation. By 4 p.m., he was in a different interview room without the attorneys because the evidentiary package Sophia Reyes had referenced turned out to be considerably more comprehensive than his legal team had anticipated, and the 2 financial officers who had agreed to preliminary interviews had by that point agreed to considerably more than that. The thing about a structure built on fabrication was that it held until the first load-bearing element was removed. After that, the timeline was physics. What? Vincent Morrow was arrested at his restaurant on the South Side at 6 p.m. while the dinner service was being set up and the kitchen was running prep, and the specific normalcy of a Tuesday evening in a working establishment was doing its best impression of a world in which nothing was about to change. He was arrested with a minimum of theater because the investigators had learned, over years of this particular work, that theater served no one and evidence served everyone. He did not resist. He was 61 years old, and he had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a moment that could be turned and a moment that was simply the end of a chapter, and this was the second kind. Felix Crane was arrested at his home in Evanston at 6:40. He opened the door himself when the investigators knocked, which suggested he had been expecting them, which suggested he was smarter in defeat than he had been in strategy. The capos who had been aligned with the Morrow network were contacted in sequence over the following 12 hours. Most cooperated. The two who did not were located within 48 hours, and the cooperation became less voluntary and more structural, the kind produced not by choice, but by the weight of evidence arranged correctly. Lucian heard about each arrest as it happened, from Saul, in increments, across the afternoon and evening of that day. He was at the Alderman building still. There had been no reason to move, and some practical reasons to stay. Sitting in the sixth-floor room with the succession documents now signed and filed and the floor plan of the East Annex still spread on the table, looking at Claire's lines. She came back at 7:30 with food that Marcus had produced from somewhere, actual food, not thermos coffee. And she sat across from him, and they ate without speaking for the first 10 minutes, because there was nothing that required saying more urgently than the need to be quiet for a moment. Saul came in with the Morrow confirmation, then the Crane confirmation, then the preliminary report on Harrison Calloway's cooperation agreement, which was developing the specific shape of a man who understood that the best remaining transaction available to him was the one that reduced his sentence rather than the one that preserved his dignity. After each piece of news, Lucien said nothing. He listened, he nodded, and Saul went back out. The room settled each time back into the sound of wind off the lake and the building's particular acoustic signature, so the creak of old steel, the specific resonance of brick that had been standing for a century. After the fourth update, Claire looked at him. "It's not what you thought it would feel like," she said. He looked at her. "No, it never is." She put down the container she was eating from. "I spent 7 years building toward a morning that was supposed to feel like arrival. When it fell apart, it felt like nothing I had modeled. And now this..." She gestured at the room, the documents, the window, and the city beyond it. "This doesn't feel like what I would have predicted either." What does it feel like? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about structural problems, without the interference of what she wanted the answer to be. Like standing in a building after the load test, when you've pushed it to the maximum and it held, and the relief is real, but it's not the same as... It doesn't cancel the memory of the pressure. Lucien looked at the floor plan on the table. His hand moved to it, not quite touching it, the gesture of someone about to handle something they were being careful with. "My father built this organization over 40 years. He believed there was no way to hold it together without the methods he used. He was probably right, for his time, for his conditions." Stopped. "I've been trying to find a different set of conditions for 15 years. And now I have 6 days and a succession document and a federal investigation that has just removed 4 of the largest obstacles in the architecture." He looked at her. "The conditions are different." "What do you do with different conditions?" "Build differently," he said, simply. The restructuring took 4 months. It was not clean, and it was not simple, and there were weeks when the legal complexity of converting the organizational structure of a 60-year criminal enterprise into a legitimate international security and logistics corporation felt less like architecture and more like archaeology, digging through decades of layered construction to find the load-bearing elements worth preserving and the ones that needed to come down. Claire worked on the physical side of it. The properties, 11 buildings across Chicago, and 2 in adjacent states that the DeLuca management company held, needed to be assessed, some restructured, some sold, Some converted to uses that would hold up to the kind of scrutiny that was now permanently trained on anything bearing the DeLuca name. She worked 16-hour days for 6 weeks, and then 12-hour days for 6 more, and then, gradually, something that resembled a sustainable pace. The permits on the Whitmore Associates projects were restored in the second month, after the Lattice Holdings filing was formally withdrawn as part of the Callaway Capital Cooperation Agreement. Kenji called her when the notice came through, and she could hear in his voice the particular relief of a man whose professional survival had been in question and was no longer. "We're okay," he said. "We're okay," she confirmed. She did not tell him everything. Some of it was not hers to tell. Some of it she was still finding the right containers for. The kind of events that required time before they could be accurately described, the way a structure required settling before you could take final measurements. Dominic came to see Lucien on the second day after the succession meeting, as he had been asked. Claire was not in the room for that conversation. She was in the building. She had become, in the way of someone who had stopped needing to define what they were doing and simply kept doing it, a persistent presence in Lucien's operational life. But she was in a different part of it, and she stayed there because she understood that the geography of certain conversations required it. She did not know exactly what was said. She knew the conversation lasted 2 hours. She knew that Dominic left the building walking the same way he had arrived, which was itself information. She knew that Lucien came to find her afterward and stood in the doorway of the room where she was working and looked at her without speaking for a moment. "He stays," Lucien said. "Different role. Reduced access for 18 months while we rebuild the trust architecture." He paused. His choice. He chose to stay. He chose to stay. She looked at the survey she had been reviewing. That was the right call. "He's 29, Lucien said. He made a decision in the dark with incomplete information because he was afraid and he didn't ask for help. I have made that exact decision before." He stopped. Not the same decision, but the same structure of it. She thought about that. She thought about a woman who had spent 7 years building toward a morning without asking herself honestly whether the building was sound. She thought about the specific texture of decisions made in the dark from fear, and how they looked in retrospect, and how they looked at the time, and how those two views were rarely the same. "Yeah," she said. "I know that structure." Ned. Lillian disappeared from the public story the way peripheral elements disappeared when the central load shifted. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, just gradually less present until the space she had occupied closed over, and it was as though the geometry had always been what it now was. The child was born in March, a girl. Ethan acknowledged her without fanfare, which was the right thing done with the minimum of noise required. And Claire heard about it from Dana, who heard about it from someone who knew someone, and she sat with the information for an afternoon and found that what she felt was something quiet and conclusive, not forgiveness, not bitterness, but the specific neutral completion of a file that had been open too long and could now be properly closed. She called Dana. "How are you?" Dana said, with the careful intonation of someone asking the real question inside the social one. "I'm good," Claire said. And then, because Dana deserved the real answer, "I'm actually good," which is different from saying it to make someone feel better. "I can tell," Dana said. "Can you? You sound like yourself, the original version, not the one you were for the last 4 years." A pause. "I missed her." Claire sat with that. She got lost for a while. She found a very dramatic way back. She really did. They talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Dana's new apartment, a project Claire was redesigning, a restaurant they kept saying they would go to, and it was the most ordinary conversation Claire had experienced in months, and it felt, for that reason, extraordinary, the way ordinary things felt when you had been without them long enough to understand what they were. The Harmon Tower atrium, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, still did what she had designed it to do. She went there alone on a day when she had a meeting in the building and arrived 40 minutes early, which she had not done accidentally. She stood in the atrium and looked at the light, the way it came through the angled glass she had specified, the way it moved across the stone floor in the particular manner she had calculated across 11 months of iteration. The way it filled the space without overwhelming it, useful and clean and completely itself. She had designed something that worked. It was still working. It would keep working after this afternoon, after this year, after she was no longer the person standing in it. There was a word for that. She did not use it out loud because she was alone and because some things did not require saying, but she stood there for 20 minutes in the moving light, and she let it be true without qualification. The old courthouse on Clark Street was a building she had always liked without having a professional reason to. It was not architecturally significant. It was simply solid, the specific solidity of a structure that had been built by people who expected it to last and had been correct in that expectation. The steps were worn in the center from a century of foot traffic, concave in a way that was simultaneously a record of use and a structural argument against it, and she had always found that interesting, the way a building absorbed evidence of the lives it had witnessed. She arrived at 6:40 on a November evening, the same month in which everything had started, the anniversary of a morning that felt, from this distance, like something that had happened to a person she remembered clearly but was no longer exactly. Lucien was there before her. He was standing at the bottom of the steps in a dark coat with his hands in his pockets and no security visible, though she had learned to understand that visible and present were different categories when it came to his arrangements. He was looking at the building. She came to stand beside him, and they looked at it together for a moment. "We signed the first documents inside," he said. "I remember. The clerk had a pen that didn't work, and we had to ask the woman at the next window for one." "I remember that too." "She had 4 pens," he said. "She gave us one and kept 3 and watched the whole thing like we were mildly interesting television." Claire looked at the worn stone steps. She wasn't wrong. He turned to look at her. She had learned his expressions across 11 months of proximity and pressure and the particular education of being in rooms where real things happened and watching how he moved through them. The controlled surface and the things that lived under it, the ones that came through only in the margins. She knew this expression. It was the one she still did not have full vocabulary for. She had stopped trying to name it and started simply recognizing it, the way you recognized a structural element that did not appear in any published catalog but was nonetheless doing essential work. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out a box, not the box from 4 months ago, a different one, smaller, and he held it without opening it for a moment, looking at her with that expression. "I need to tell you something first," he said. "Tell me." "When I put the ring on your finger in the parking structure, I was running a calculation. I knew who you were. I knew your permits. I knew the structural value of your name in the succession context." He stopped. "What I did not know, what I had no variable for, was the thing you had already done. 30 seconds before I asked you anything. Standing up in a parking structure in a ruined dress for a bleeding stranger, you didn't know." He looked at her steadily. "That wasn't in the calculation. That was the thing that made the calculation incomplete." She looked at him, the courthouse steps, the worn center, November in Chicago, cold and certain, and without any of the softness that other cities wore as camouflage. "I know," she said. "I want to ask you something that isn't in any document," he said. "No terms, no duration, no exit conditions." She waited. He opened the box. The ring inside was not the one she had been wearing. It was not the one Ethan had given her in a restaurant 2 years ago while his mother filmed it. It was not the architectural band he had slid across the table on the morning the lawyers had left. It was something else, a design she did not recognize, precise and original, the kind of thing made by a person who had paid attention to what she looked at and how she looked at it and had commissioned something that was entirely and specifically for her. "Marry me," he said, "not for succession, not for permits, not for any of the reasons we started with." He held the box steady. His hands did not shake. They never shook. She had observed this under conditions that would have produced shaking in most people, but there was something in the quality of his stillness right now that was different from operational stillness, the kind he wore as function. This was the stillness of someone who had arrived at maximum exposure and was holding still by choice rather than by training. "Marry me because we have already been through the worst available version of everything and we are both still here, and that is the only foundation I know how to trust." The city ran its noise behind them. Traffic and wind, and the low, continuous sound of a place that had been running since before either of them were born. Claire looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about structure, the way it held, the way it failed, the way the best of it did both and survived the second, because it had been designed honestly for the first. She thought about a woman standing in a parking structure in a soaked dress who had stood up not because she was brave, but because something in her had looked at the alternative and found it worse than the risk. She thought about what it meant to build something that would still be doing what it was designed to do after you were gone. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. It had been made to fit. And she understood, in the way she understood structural things, bone deep, certain, without requiring the confirmation of a second opinion, that this was a measurement he had taken carefully, with the specific attention of a man who intended to be accurate. Yes, she said, not because she needed protection, not because the calculation required it, because they had stood in the same rooms and made the same hard choices in the same bad light and come through the other side of it with their foundations intact, and that was not a thing you walked away from when you were a person who understood what it took to build something that lasted. He looked at her for a moment, then the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued at some point in the last 11 months. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to one, the structural element that supported it. She took his arm. They walked up the worn steps together, the center-worn steps, the ones that held a century of evidence in their concavity, and pushed through the heavy door into the light of the building, and the door swung closed behind them with the particular sound of old weight finding its rest, solid and complete. Outside, Chicago continued its indifferent and magnificent noise. The lake moved. The lights came on in the towers, floor by floor, the way lights always came on when the day was ending and people were still inside doing the work that needed doing. And in the atrium of the Harmon Tower, 23 blocks north, the last of the afternoon light was finishing its arc across the stone floor in the pattern she had designed 11 months of her life to produce, moving, precise, and completely itself until the moment the day ran out and the building held its darkness quietly, the way good structures held everything they were given and waited for morning.